Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope you're doing well. This is going to be the first in a series of videos on the first series of essays from Ralph Waldo Emerson, published in the 1840s originally, and a very influential series of essays and sort of series of thought in the United States for at least, I would say, 140, 150 years. And then gradually over that time, there had been a decrease in influence, I would say perhaps after World War II. And I think that has continued, but I'm hoping to explore these essays, what they still contain for us, perhaps some ideas that we sort of look askance at, or question and interrogate a little bit more fully, and hopefully just make this an enjoyable sort of series across the year for me. So it'll be the 10th of each month. This opening essay is history. Next month will be self-reliance, and I'll put a PDF of the text in the description box below. So let's jump in. The first thing I want to talk about is what might be the most quoted sentence from this essay, and that is that it's often paraphrased, but I'll give the full sentence. All history becomes subjective. In other words, there is properly no history, only biography. Often it's contracted to simply, there is no history, only biography. And that's kind of in the middle of the essay, but it's great to quote it at the beginning because it introduces a key theme, which we're going to see across the first series of essays, which is this theme of the individual, the theme of the individual relying on the individual. Next month with self-reliance, that's going to be very critical. But this concept of individualism, and I think this is the single part from Emerson that has lasted, 180 years at this point now. And we can of course interrogate that, and I will hope to across these videos across this year. But that's a salient point from Emerson, is that the individual is critical, that we have to understand history from an individual lens, what we have in our own experiences, and he gives multiple examples of these, and recognizing that the actions of an individual from history are embedded in that individual's identity and experiences and that person's biography. That history in a sense reveals the biography of the individuals who are creating history. So in the first paragraph, there's almost this sense where he talks about once you have entered the temple, you can think the thoughts of Plato or those of a saint, and this idea that by being a thinking human, each of us has the capability to think any thought, to be part of any branch of knowledge within humanity. And that's how he's going to open. I want to contrast that at the end with how he closes. We then get into this idea that thought precedes fact. That a law is originally in someone's mind, that actions that people take are in their mind. And so this sense of if we're studying historical actions, we're really actually studying historical minds, and to a certain extent the impulses that drive those minds, what I think Plato, through Socrates as his mouthpiece in, for example, the Phaedo, would call his daimon. And then he has this other sense. The world exists for the education of each man. There is no age or state of society or mode of action in history to which there is not somewhat corresponding in his life. And again, this sense of individuality, we as individuals, when we take from history, we take from it as individuals. Can seem a little selfish. Moving forward, the difference between men is in their principle of association. And he moves on. The progress of the intellect is to clearer visions of causes, which neglects surface differences. And I think that's one of the more valuable pieces that Emerson introduces in this essay, which is, reinforcing that idea of not just, hey, you're an individual, you're special, go for it, trust yourself. There's a lot of that in this essay. But rather, use history to inform your experiences, find the analogous piece, look at the root cause within that historical antecedent, and examine the root causes within your own life and the history of your own actions and what you're doing. And there is something beneficial in that, in my opinion. The identity of history is equally intrinsic, the diversity equally obvious. There is at the surface infinite variety of things. At the center there is simplicity of cause. And later on, nature is an endless combination of repetition of very few laws. And now we get our second theme within this essay, which is not just the idea of the individual, but the idea of the universal. And there's this sense that as individuals, we all belong to some universal. That the reason that we can place, and draw as individuals from the examples of history and from the examples of nature is because there are these like universal laws or truths that from their center emanate all these branches of diversity that seem, as he had mentioned, on the surface very different, but at their core are governed by just a handful of things. And there, this becomes an intriguing idea for philosophers, for scientists. Is it possible to identify these natural laws? A grand unifying theory, unifying the different like theories from physics. E.O. Wilson in biology and sociobiology pushes this idea of consilience. Can we find this handful of key ideas from which we can explain everything else? And Emerson believes that there are, without being an expert in any of those fields. Much later on, he has this statement: all public facts are to be individualized, all private facts are to be generalized. And like, what does that mean? How does one go about doing that? We can take public ideas and consider what they mean for us individually, but what does it mean to take our private facts and generalize those? Does it mean that we just seek, does that imply a certain empathy and sympathy with others through the human condition, this universal human condition, or is Emerson getting at something else? And it's not always clear what he means, because within this own essay it seems that he can be contradictory. He adds, civil and natural history, the history of art and literature, must be explained from individual history or must remain words. The true poem is the poet's mind. The true ship is the ship builder. And he has a number of ways of talking about this concept of, like, again, see the product, examine, whether it's an action or an actual sculpture or a piece of architecture art. Now get into the human who was behind that. Now get into the human mind that was behind that. That's what you should be examining. And there's this interesting, this is about one of the only places where he talks about this reliance on almost this like individual spark. That's my own term. He doesn't use that term. And that's where we start to see the suggestion of the transcendentalism that many know Emerson for, that we're sort of seeing here, but not real explicitly until towards the end. And almost this like panentheist thought that Emerson, again, is quite famous for. And it does remind one a little bit of the verse from Luke 17, 21, chapter 17, verse 21, where it says, the kingdom of God is within you, as part of that verse. He goes on to list, he talks about architecture, he talks about these great men of God, and kind of the way they push against institutions. And this is where we start to see that Emerson is going to subvert everything he's been writing about. He talks a lot about Prometheus and a little bit about Jesus. And then we get this really interesting statement. And I want to contrast this to that idea he said earlier of, there's at the surface infinite variety of things, at the center there's simplicity of cause. This idea that we could find these few simple causes. He says this: Tantalus means the impossibility of drinking the waters of thought, which are always gleaming and waving within sight of the soul. So he says there's just these few things, but can you ever actually grasp them? And he doesn't really answer himself. He again gives us this a little bit more architecture and this idea of how there's laws emerge as a resistance to nomadic tendencies in early humans, and he has sort of this postulate for early civilization. There's some historical accuracy. It's not perfect. Emerson had not been to all of the places he was writing about in this essay. And then we start to get at this weird interlude that again pushes that sort of transcendental idea he has, and can feel not only subversive to his own prior words, the prior 15 pages, but also I think need to be interrogated. And he says, there's this danger of people relying on facts and becoming men of sense, and that there are these other better men, these higher men who, true to their better instincts, refuse the dominion of facts. Well, we've seen what happens when people refuse the dominion of facts and how dangerous that can be. I think at best, perhaps, what the most charitable interpretation would be: don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't miss the prime root causes behind all of the facts you see. Find the unifying aspects to those. But he's never explicit in saying that. And he does push this idea of within the true self, within nature, someone who's closer to nature is going to have a true understanding of all these things than the person who just knows a bunch of facts. And there is a difference between knowledge and wisdom, but I do think, particularly with tendencies we've seen, not only here in the United States but elsewhere, castigating a person as a person of sense who relies on facts is a little dubious. We again get a nice little sentence: "A man is a bundle of relations." I agree. And then we get towards the end, and this is where he turns over the whole work on us and reveals his true self. He goes, "I am ashamed to see what a shallow village tale our so-called history is." And he's talked about how, lizards and insects and, fungus and stuff. What does the history of Rome or an Olympiad or this architecture or what does it have to do with any of their experiences, what they know, what is their history? And he goes on and talks about like a child or a person, who is not from what he regards as the higher races. Emerson, not me. That those people are closer to the true knowledge because the path of science and letters is not the way into nature. And I don't know, like what do we mean by nature with that? And certainly in the midst of a pandemic, there certainly is a reliance on science as a way of using science to examine nature, to find ways to preserve all of the human life that we can hopefully make more connections to. So as with all of these essays, there's going to be parts of it where it seems like there's some really cool like nuggets and ideas to pull from, and then there's going to be other parts where we have to remember this is someone writing in the 1840s who's come from a wildly privileged background. He only ever uses the word men in this essay. He does make like clearly racist statements, and so we have to be able to understand that is, again, Emerson's writing this. His biography is that of privilege, is that of a particular view. And he's able to draw some interesting ideas, but he also presents some ideas that I think need to be interrogated and perhaps have not always been in the United States. Some other quick, Emerson jumping off points. He is influenced by the Romantic movement, the High Romantic movement. He's a deep Anglophile. He mentions Goethe explicitly in the essay. And so the Romantics are a key touchstone for Emerson. One of his, not quite disciples, but someone who was certainly influenced and sort of a contemporary of Emerson and went down that route of nature in some very different ways would have been, of course, Henry David Thoreau. I think in terms of modern artists or thinkers, someone who jumps to mind would be Terrence Malick. Specifically, I think in The Tree of Life, where he has the famous statement, there are two paths, the path of nature and the path of grace. And just like what a perfect, encapsulation of how one could absorb Emerson and at the same time question Emerson. His journals reveal a great deal of his insight into, the 2 decades before he created the essays and the decade in which he was writing the essays. And then it's always comical to find contemporaries of Emerson, where Emerson talks about how John Quincy Adams is a boring speaker, and then John Quincy Adams in his diary refers to Mr. Emerson reading a poem, and the best part of it being that it was short enough that it ended. So this was history. Next month will be self-reliance. I'll put PDFs of both essays for anyone to read. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you've read the essay. If you took it in different directions, I'd be happy to learn from you. So thanks, everybody.